One race from the same place that make the same trip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region. For we woman and we children. That must be the ambition of the Caribbean and the Caribbean and the Caribbean.
And welcome to this week's edition of the Open Word Podcast. And we continue our series with Professor Clive Thomas on Guyana's oil. Last week, of course, we discussed Guyana's oil within the context of CARICOM. And this week, we want to turn our attention to that contract. Anyone who is familiar with the conversation on oil in Guyana would know that the contract has been back, front, center of the discussion. We've heard all kinds of perspectives as far as the contract is concerned. Today we're going to engage Professor Clive Thomas on that contract and try to get from him what his take on the contract is. We know that the dominant aspect of the conversation is the contract is a bad contract, and there is pressure on the government to renegotiate the contract. Clearly, the PPP found itself in a bind because when the contract was signed under the coalition, the PPP said it was a bad contract. They joined with others. And they said that when they come to power, they would renegotiate the contract. Upon attaining office, they've reneged on that promise. And so the conversation goes on. This week also is the 43rd anniversary of the assassination of Walter Rodney, and it's June 13th is what we will call a sacred day for WPA and those who are who identify with Walter Rodney and his legacy. And so we are going to have that discussion on the contract, and we're going to do so within the context of Walter Rodney and his ideas. That is, try to bring Walter Rodney into the present, if, as it were, or to talk about the contract against the backdrop of ideas of Walter Rodney. And who better to do so than Professor Clive Thomas, who is very close to Walter. In fact, it is said that Clive played a very important role in getting Walter to come back to Guyana in 1974. They had both been teaching in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, University of Dar es Salaam, and Clive had come back to Guyana, and the story has it that he was very, very, very instrumental in convincing Rodney to come back home. And so they were very close comrades. They, I think they taught in Jamaica together. What is not well known, what is well known is that Rodney himself was banned from Jamaica in 1968. What is not so well known is that Clive Thomas himself was later banned from Jamaica. So I'm saying all of that to say that Professor Thomas is well placed to talk about Walter Rodney's ideas and how those ideas can help us understand and navigate this new era of the petro state. So let's bring in Professor Thomas. Professor Thomas, how are you today?
Very well, going very well today, David. Thank you.
Yes, and we are taping this.
Of course, it's a Sunday.
Yes, go ahead.
You have to memorialize that. And I'm
Yes.
glad that you have located the program in that context.
Thank you. And Just to verify some tidbits I mentioned in the introduction first, that you yourself were banned from Jamaica, teaching there at Mona, and secondly that you also taught in Tanzania for a short while with Walton, that you were instrumental in, if you will, convincing him to come back to Guyana. Any truth in those little tidbits?
Yes, there's a large modicum of truth in that. And they're all three propositions. There's a lot of truth in that. He started teaching Jamaica before I did. And when I went there, a couple of years after, he got banned. And as a result of the protests, we became sort of intellectual comrades. And then he went to Tanzania, and I had a sabbatical year. I came to Guyana as a professor at the University of Guyana. I had a sabbatical year, and I spent it in Tanzania. That's how I was there for the year, as a visiting professor. And we had conversations which led to the decision they took to come back. I was then heading the union at the University of Guyana. So we did everything in our power to try to get him employed. It was a very rocky road.
Yes.
But even more immediate and to the conversation we're going to have today about the oil contract, I can remember that the APNU government had made a terrible error in not making the contract public. There's no point in keeping a contract like that secret. There's nothing to gain from it. And I can remember we had the minister responsible for oil, Trotman, visiting the WPA office to brief us on the oil industry. And I can remember we made a plea to him at that meeting to, in the name of Walter Rodney, make the contract public. So this becomes part of a revolutionary gesture on his behalf. But we got nowhere with it. And it took nearly another year before the contract was made public. And I don't see what could possibly have been gained by keeping it a secret. So the government started out on the wrong footing in terms of the relations with the public, and that has continued ever since. Some sections of the press have never forgiven them for that. And successive governments have found that the anti-contract sort of group, or I should say voice in Guyana, has dominated the conversation.
Yeah. Let's go back to, if you will, classical international relations, if there is such a thing. But here is a small country, happenstance as you describe it. We happened upon oil, and we are negotiating with a big giant, oil giant. What is the chance? What does history tell us about?
I don't. I'm glad you asked that question, because most people don't know the history. The history is that we have several forms of contracts which we use for oil exploration and development in developing countries. We have what we call in Guyana production sharing agreement. And that production sharing agreement, or PSA, was, when it was introduced in the 1960s, considered as revolutionary, because for the first time, the contracts allowed the governments to retain ownership of the oil, while the contractor, ExxonMobil in our case, and their co-venturers, Nexen and CNOOC, they were allowed to produce the oil that they found, if they found any, take the risks of that exploration and development, take all the costs, and then if they were successful, we have what is called a product sharing agreement, where you have a royalty and where you have a recovery mechanism for any costs that they involved with in trying to find the oil and to produce the oil. and then you have a profit split. And that is the fundamental relationship we have with the companies. And that was considered revolutionary because that was the basis for the growth of OPEC. Prior to that, developing countries just had oil companies coming in, owning the whole country. If they found oil and it belonged to them. The government didn't have any control over what happened because they took all the risks and they claimed that they should have all the benefit. But the production sharing agreement was an attempt by the developing countries to counter that colonial regulation. So there are people who were fighting for production sharing agreements as a redress from the exploitation that was happening in the rest of the oil world. So the effect of that production sharing agreement was twofold. One is that it gave strength and structure to OPEC, which was formed and which remains now perhaps the most important global player, because it now includes Russia as well as all the other countries that originally had. It's called OPEC Plus. And it also allowed for the creation of what is called the independent firms, not the big majors, the big multinationals. And for many countries that people think are dominated by multinationals, their actual production, big countries we all know about, are in fact dominated by the independent majors. So the world is very different from what is being portrayed. And people just got not caught up in the history. And misinformation and disinformation runs riot. So the other thing is that I think is important from that point of view is that what the OPEC countries had managed to do was to create national oil companies as the option for the state owning it, owning the mineral rights. You see, remember I started out by saying the government owns all the oil.
Yes.
But what they do, they vested it in a company, a state-owned company. So when the co-venturer or the contractor is producing oil, that company is part of the mechanism, because you can only deal with that company effectively under company law, not public law. They're not a public corporation, they're private companies. So by creating a national oil company, you create a structure which allows you, by taking out shares, how much you like to, will have to determine and seek to have control in the operations of the company by participating in the ownership of the company. So the company law that is being used within the country, you are a part of, so you benefit or not from whatever it does. That is why we've always maintained in the WPA, as you will recall, that the first priority we would do was to create a national oil company and take out shares in the operations based on the product that we own and we can, offer as value for shares. That is the mechanism that they used. And these companies eventually took over the international companies. Because they hear about Saudi Aramco and all these things. Now you don't hear about Exxon and things in the Middle East anymore. So they eventually dominated, which was the intention behind the idea of moving to the production sharing agreement. So that basic history is not understood. I don't think the authorities even know what we set about to do when they joined and decided to operate a PSA.
Mm-hmm.
And they willfully ignore, because they've been arguing for this going back to 2016. That's 7 years ago. It's never once been publicly discussed outside of any column that I wrote. At least I've never seen it.
Right. Now, let me ask you this question. Does geopolitics play any role in determining the nature of oil contracts?
Yes, very, very important, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Because oil itself is a political commodity.
Uh-huh.
Remember, it's a primary source of energy for transportation, for buildings, for any form of fuel that you use in the world. It's also important, however, also for producing chemical feedstock. So all the major chemicals that we have on the earth are derived from petroleum. And in addition to that, all the common household products that we use are derived from petroleum. From the bathtub cleaners to the soaps, to the detergents, to the makeup, even to the sweeteners like saccharin. All that is made from petroleum. So the chemical feedstock of the world and the common household products of the world all come from oil. And unless we understand that, we will fail to understand that the transition away from oil is not, as the politicians are putting it, an easy thing to do. It is not just wishful thinking. It's a revolution in the way in which we live and exist and have come to know development in the world. It transforms all these opportunities. That is why I remember when I wrote the book on sugar, because sugar or sucrose is the only alternative to petroleum. It can make every product that petroleum can, because it can be broken down into alcohol and become a primary product. And that is why I've written a book on the sugar fetter challenge. Because at one time, the companies were really going to go into biological fuel.
Mm-hmm.
There was even a company that set up a sort of experimental plant in Britain at Knowsley to produce the chemicals, chemicals as they call it. And the chemical would have replaced the petroleum chemicals, because all the chemicals we use basically now, 90% or more, come through petroleum. But they can also come, the only other alternative route is through sugar, because sugar can be broken down into sucrose, which is the other primary material on earth that can produce every other chemical.
Yeah. So is it safe to assume that the Venezuelan threat to Guyana's territory might have influenced the outcome as far as the contract is concerned?
Well, I wasn't there at the time for any of the negotiations, so I don't want to presume
Right.
too much, but I would imagine that they had to play a part. Because just look at the role that Pompeo played when he was for a short time Secretary of State in Guyana.
Mm-hmm.
I've always expressed suspicion that one of Trump's objectives is to get into the oil in Guyana.
Yeah.
I've always feared that he was going to use his political power and leverage, his hegemon status, to move into the oil sector in this country. And I fear that because I fear him as a man, as a despot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, one of the first problems with the contract was, of course, the sign-in bonus, and there was a big issue with it. And I remember the WPA coming out very strongly and asking them to make public the sign-in bonus. You make reference to our stance, and we met with the minister in relation to the sign-in bonus. Tell us a little bit about sign-in bonuses. How do you arrive at the formula for a sign-in bonus in contracts?
There's no real formula. It's just agreeing on a fee that they're paying. And the fee is, of course, spread over the oil you produce. So the more the volume of oil you produce, the less becomes the actual fee you agree on upfront as a share of the oil you're producing. So if you give a fee of $80 million and you only produce 1 million barrels of oil, it's about 18 cents a barrel. But if you spread it over a couple of million or hundreds of millions of barrels, it's just cents, petty cents. So it's really not a significant means of gathering an income from oil. And what you have to do is also to recognize that if you were to compare the yields or the benefits you get from a contract, you have to take everything into account. A company can give you a large bonus and spread it out over a lot of oil over the years. It really comes down to nothing. And you might feel happy because you get it today. And so you're glad for the money and you're going to rush and sign the oil deal. So I would say the signature bonus is the least important contribution to the fiscal revenue that you get
Uh-huh.
from oil.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
royalty and the company taxes are the most important.
The royalty and the company taxes are the most important. Let
Yeah,
me,
but,
yeah,
it also depends on that distribution as well. You
that
can't
distribution.
isolate, you can't take one tax and compare it with another tax. Because
Right.
the studies have been done, which show academic studies, that if you apply the US oil regime rates to Guyana, we would only get 40% of what we're getting now. So it shows that even though people think that we are not doing well compared to the US, and of course they expect that because the US is more efficient and we've been doing this a long time, that the yield from our PSA, our oil contract, is significantly better than that, the US terms. Again, you have to take everything in the contract that is going to yield fiscal revenue to compare. You can't just isolate the signature bonus because a large bonus means nothing. In fact, what we talk about when we discuss these things in economics, we talk about the take ratio. We never talk about take in an absolute amount. And a take ratio depends on the numerator and the denominator. Because the ratio, half or 20% or 40% is 30 over 100 or 40 over 100. It's a ratio. So a small ratio over a large amount, a large volume of oil, gives more than a high ratio, the punitive values, over a small amount. So when you're devising a contract, you have to be able to balance both what you get from the revenue with what you might lose from failing to get investments needed to maximize the production of oil. It's never one-way street. So what we have to do in Guyana, that is why all contracts are incomplete and they have to be continuously renegotiated. So when people tell me you need to renegotiate a contract, I don't know of any contract in the world that has not been renegotiated. The only ones that they feel want to negotiate by law was slavery, because that was a binding forward contract to own your labor by owning you. But every other contract, including wages, no matter what it is bound to put discussion and legal challenge.
Let me ask you this. What factors determine when a contract is negotiated?
It depends on the parties to the contract.
Uh-huh.
Contract is a living instrument, and the parties are contending over it all the time. They benefit from it at times and they lose from it, and so they're negotiating and not negotiating. This continues all the time. So your mindset must be continuous negotiation. There's not something somebody calls for in a day one or day 50. It's an inherent part of all contracts. That is why we have a contract between the state and a contractor, or another company and another company owned by the state, a national oil company, and the company that is doing the contracting work. And that is why it's important to have the inside track by having a national oil company own part of the company that is producing the oil. Not own it in the sense of own the entirety, but own some part of it to give them a seat at the table.
Yeah. See why I want you to address in some detail in the time we have left this whole question of what exactly are we in Guyana getting? Because there have been all kinds of speculations, all kinds of disagreements over what the contract says?
I've published, and will probably be publishing soon. I think I published it recently. The 5 studies that have been done to measure the value we get from our contract, what is called the government stake ratio.
Yes.
These were done by the Open Oil NGO, the University of Trinidad and Tobago, the Inter-American Development Bank, Rystad Energy, which is a private commercial firm from Norway, and Wood Mackenzie is a British oil intelligence analysis firm. And the 5 ratios fall between 52, or let's say 51 plus, because it's not quite 52. 51 plus 50% to 60%. I've published the results, and I published it maybe at least 6 times over the years I've been writing, and nobody's ever challenged it. I don't really think they read it, so it doesn't really matter. And these figures are there. And it's in a very recent article too. I think it might even be, it's certainly in the context of what I'm doing, because now I'm looking at the proposed public auctions. Because people believe that when you put the thing on auction, you're going to get a lot more money. And I'm setting up the conditions to test that in these articles I'm writing. So the aim of the public auction of the blocks is to, I argue, to raise the reserve price. And it's only going to be successful if the reserve price is raised and the quantities that we are producing of oil continues the same, they don't fall off. That there's no elasticity to the curve. So if we raise the price, people buy less. The investors take less. So I'm setting up the conditions to test that in the current set of articles I'm writing. But I tend to write ahead my articles.
Right,
so
right.
I don't know well I'm telling you what I'm doing for July, and it's not really this month. But I've gone through that exercise already. Because you see, the aims of a public auction are manifold, but the government has singled out one, raising the price, getting more from the contract. And I think that is because they don't know how to handle the criticisms. And they have been sucked into this feeling that they have to show they can get more. And I'm very fearful, quite fearful, that the opposite might happen. That the competitive attractiveness of our contract may be diminished because the price is not worth it. But we cannot rule on that yet, because we're in a situation where the finds have been continuing to grow, the discoveries are continuing to grow. And Guyana's oil look as if it's in a pretty good market, because it's considered to be the right grades, the desired grades, medium to light, sweet crude, highly desired, and benefiting from a significant premium in the market for selling crude oil.
Professor, as we close out on this program, I want to go back to Walter Rodney, because one of the things that my generation of scholar activists really grasp from your generation, you and Walter Rodney's generation, is the sheer breadth of your scholarship, that coming from the Caribbean, that your scholarship by necessity had to be broad. And the thing about a scholarship that is broad is that people tend to pick out aspects of that scholarship and evaluate the scholar based on that single aspect of the scholarship. And it's something that has frustrated me with the way in which people have treated Walter Rodney. I think they have boxed him into corners to suit their benefits, to endorse their political positions. So I want to ask you to reflect on how Walter Rodney's scholarship and his activism, his ideas, could help us make more sense of the present. I mean, we spend a lot of time talking about the past. Is activism against authoritarian regimes at the time, because people sometimes confine him to Guyana, and you yourself confine, but your book, The Rise of the Authoritarian State, used the Caribbean as the base, but really was looking at the authoritarian state globally. How, as we enter this era of petro-state, and with all the contradictions that we are seeing and the difficulty in trying to explain the present within the context of our larger history, how could a Walter Rodney, his ideas, his activism help us in a time like this?
I think, first of all, understanding what is the purpose of politics. The purpose of the present politics, I think, and I think this is a view he shares, certainly is a view I've exchanged a lot with him, is to change the present.
Yeah.
So scholarship without construction, without ideas for building a new and better future, to my mind, is a pointless scholarship. It becomes dogmatic, it becomes almost robotic, almost like it was geometry and not really live human awareness politics. So I think to avoid that sort of stereotyping, to avoid being caught in the trap where you see the present as perpetuating and don't see the changes that are taking place, whether they favor you or not. It's a very sterile type of perception to bring to politics. Changes are taking place all the time. So even though the world is not getting to the place that I would like it to go to, it'd be foolish of me to see the world in 2023 as it was in 1973. I just consider it absurd to anybody to expect me to do that. So once you start from that sort of premise, scholarship itself is a living, growing organism. And the difference between us as a species and the rest of human existence, animal life and so forth, no matter how complicated and advanced, is that we bring one independent force to this cosmic place that we are all in. That is consciousness. We are conscious to the point where we can distinguish between life and death. We know what it is to die. Animals don't know that. They don't have a sense of consciousness. They can feel terror, they can feel all the things that we feel, but they don't rise to the level of consciousness. So our contribution to the philosophy of going forward is always to expand the consciousness of humans as a species. So we have to embrace the coming of an era where space and all these sorts of things will be more routine in our existence than the things we bother with now. So I find it fascinating. We can be still preoccupied with the battles of the 1970s and be moving into a world in which people are envisaging the growth of artificial intelligence, which can do 90% of all the things that we do now. Even run this program, it can even simulate you and simulate my response.
Yeah.
Without us being here. Because they have enough of my writings and it will learn it fast enough, maybe in an hour, and of your writings to know the questions that you would want to ask and know how I would answer them. So that is the world we're moving into. So we need a different type of approach to it, and we need a recognition that we're not at any time ever in stasis. We are always moving, always expanding, always going forward. I'm not a religious person, you know, but I mean, that is what drives my feeling about the things that we try to do.
Mhm. Mhm. Professor Clive Thomas there, put it in context of Walter Rodney and the present. Of course, people try to say what Walter Rodney would have done if he were alive and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And of course, Professor Thomas avoids that pitfall because we can never know what the person would have done. But we can't as heroic as our struggle was in the 1970s and the 1980s. We just can't, as activists and political people, be stuck there. We have to keep paying attention to the changes that are happening in the world. But Professor Thomas, I always want to ask you this question. The WPA is the only party of that radical left-wing revolutionary parties that arose in the late 60s, early 70s in the Anglophone Caribbean. WPA is the only one that has survived. Any ideas as to why is that just happenstance, to use one of
So
your...
I feel, but I have to be very careful because I don't want to sound conceited.
Right.
But I feel one difference that we managed to strike a chord on is our rapid embrace of the democratic way forward.
Yeah.
That what we've always argued is as descendants of slaves, we have as much commitment to freedom of persons, to freedom of personhood, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of all these things that we talk about, as any species or any group on earth. We have an authentic claim to that as the descendants of slaves and colonial enslavement. And I feel once we're in that space, nobody can take a more righteous philosophical position than us. And we stand as equals with all.
And what a way to pay tribute to Walter Rodney, because of course I was a youngster in the 70s and 80s, and I remember the
We
debate.
handing over to you, you know. So you
I remember the debates as to whether these things are represent bourgeois democracy or not. And so I remember that, and that debate was not just confined to us in the WPA, but it was across the left and
yeah.
in the region. And I think I have to concur that that's really a defining point there in the survival of parties that came into being at a particular time, asking particular questions. But how do you survive that time as the world changes around you? Professor Clive Thomas, as always, leaving us with something to think about. And on this anniversary of the assassination of Walter Rodney, I think you've given us something to take us at least for another year. Thank you very much for sharing with us again this week.
Thank you, David. Okay.
Thank you. And you can tell from my response that I enjoy these conversations because it helps us to grab. When you live for 80 odd years as Clive Thomas and you spend the majority of those 80 odd years thinking about your society, thinking about how to move the society forward, you accumulate so much in terms of perspective that younger thinkers, younger activists, younger scholars are able to sharpen their own instincts as to what's happening around them. And if I sometimes criticize those in the generation after me for being a little bit slow in recognizing how much the world is changing around us, it is because, as a friend of mine always tells me, you take it for granted, you and others in the WPA take it for granted that you all had every day and still have everyday access to the Clive Thomases and Walter Rodney and Kwayan and Ruth Narayan and Dai and Maurice Odle and so on, not in a schoolroom environment, but as brothers and comrades. And that people like myself have a responsibility, in a sense, to be the bridge between that generation of scholar activists and the world out there. I give the story of going to a funeral of a young man who was shot by the police in Buxton, and meeting these scores and scores of young people who I didn't know exist in my own village at the back there. And them recognizing me, of course, on TV and the internet and so on, and schooling me on Sunday. And one of the things they ask me, they look me in my face. These are 18, 19, 20 years old who we think don't pay attention to politics. But here they're telling me about politics 101, and they're asking me, whatever happened to the $1 million, the 5,000 US that you all talk about? These are young people we think aren't paying attention to politics, recognizing me and asking me whatever happened, and then would go on to tell me, the next time you all have power, know that you all have to give something real to your people, because we are real. This is what young 18, 19, 20-year-old kids are telling me on Sunday. Kids who are obviously unemployed and so on, but fascinating about what they know and what we sometimes assume they don't know. They know about the Buxton proposal. You may say because they're from Buxton, because I'm from Buxton, because the proposal is called Buxton, but I am confident that that is replicated in other communities across Guyana. It was a learning experience for me on Sunday, all right? Not to take young people for granted, because the world is changing, and even young people today who we assume are so disconnected from politics and economics are, in a sense, more connected than we are. Professor Clive Thomas always tells us in it, these kids are smarter. What they can do with that cell phone, we could not dream of doing when we were I just wanted to say that as I myself joined Professor Thomas in recognizing and observing this day, June 13th, there is certainly hope for our country, for our region, and for those who the Jamaican Rastafarians would call the sufferers, So I take my leave, and I'll see you again next week for another edition of the Open Word, Guyana's Oil with Professor Clive Thomas.
One race from the same place that make the same trip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention, is for a better life in the region, for we women and we children.